Oh, March, we have had some serious highs and lows. Hello and welcome back. My name is Caitlin and I love to read. Today I want to talk to you about the 7 books that I read in March and rank them on a star scale, whereas 0 stars is just a literary abomination of hot garbage, and 5 stars is something that I consider a really great book, the best of the best, like a contender for one of my favorites of all time. The first book that I read this month is called Shark Heart. It is a book that I was going to rank initially lower than the 4.5 stars that I gave it, but this book really stuck with me and I've thought about it a lot over the last month. Lewis and Ren fall in love and get married, but shortly after their wedding, Lewis notices some weird symptoms that he's having, and so he goes to the doctors and finds out that he is slowly turning into a great white shark. Now, when I read the synopsis for this book, I didn't know what to expect. It's a very weird plot. It's almost like if somebody asked the author, "Would you still love me if I was a worm?" And she was like, "Hold that thought. I'm gonna write a whole book to answer your question." I thought it was gonna be really funny and whimsical, but it was actually very touching and sad. I cried a lot during this book. It's called Shark Heart, a love story, and it really struck me that this book talks about all types of love. In the beginning of this story, we see new romance, that kind of naive puppy love, where 2 people are the very best versions of themselves and they're full of promises and hope. We see spousal love during a terminal illness where the relationship totally transforms, the priorities change, the conversations change, and the love just transforms into a whole different beast. This was such a touching part of the book and it was so deeply sad. We see love of self, especially in Lewis's journey with his transformation. He mourns the old things that he loved that he can no longer do and tries to accept his future. I thought that this was a really beautiful story of self-love. There's an interesting subplot in this book where our female main character makes friends with this little pregnant lady, and the pregnant lady is giving birth to 2 birds. Now, it's a very high-risk pregnancy because when the birds are ready to come out, instead of a vaginal delivery like most normal births would be, they will likely peck her to death from the inside out like an egg. She decides not to abort them because of her love of God and her potential love of her unborn children birds. And I thought that that was interesting. In the second half of the book, the story follows Ren's mother, and it talks a lot about parental love, both biological and in found families, as she starts to become closer to her community. We also see what love looks like in a really abusive and toxic relationship with an older man, and we see all the trauma that ensues afterwards. This book was so moving. It really struck a chord with me. I expected it to be silly and kind of superficial, but it was a very interesting story. And again, I've thought about it so much in the last couple of weeks. Okay, next I'm going to talk about A Court of Mist and Fury, and I have a confession. I tried to get into this series a long time ago, but I wound up DNFing this book, and I want to tell you all about it, but there are some spoilers I'll have to kind of share in order to do so. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses, and I was so in love with that book. I was just crazy about it. I thought it was an excellent retelling of Beauty and the Beast that was just so rich. I loved the storyline, I loved the lore, and I really liked the relationship between Farah and Tamlin. But in book 2, I just could not get over the 180 degrees personality flip that happened with our golden lion boy. What happened to our sweet, romantic, thoughtful High Lord? Who the hell is this guy? Whomster Yoomst? I felt bamboozled. I spent so long shipping this couple. I spent an entire book falling in love with Farah and Tamlin together. Farah gave everything for their happy ever after, and he just ruined it by becoming a controlling douchebag. I was floored. I just felt like the rug got pulled out from under me. I felt like Tyra Banks when she was yelling at Tiffany in America's Next Top Model. That was me.
I was rooting for you. We were all rooting for you. How dare you? Learn something from this. When you go to bed at night, you lay there and you take responsibility for yourself, because nobody's going to take responsibility for you.
Anyway, I felt personally attacked by Sarah J. Maas, so I stopped reading it. But then time passed. I survived a pandemic. I grew up. I was ready to get hurt again. And so I reread ACOTAR, and I braced myself for disappointment as I reread ACOMAF. And guess what? I loved it. I was all about the quests and the monsters in this book that gave us a deeper understanding of the world and the lore. I loved the story with the Weaver in the Woods. That was probably my favorite. And I loved the story with the Bone Carver and the rendezvous with the Soriel. All of it. I was into all of it. I also really appreciated Farah's character arc in this book. I feel like in all of book one, she was really like a victim of circumstance, but then in the second book, she really regains control of her autonomy. I'm also a fan of the new side characters that were introduced in this book. Is it a perfect read? No, I still have some issues with the romance aspect of the book, but it was really so enjoyable for me overall that I do give it 5 stars and I stand by that. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the book Bride, and oof, Bride, what a letdown. If you saw my Ali Hazelwood book review, you would know that I'm not a fan of this book, so I'm going to give it a solid 2 stars. I just found the whole book to be so corny, and to be fair, I don't know if I'm the right target audience for this book. I'm not into like the Omegaverse, so I found myself cringing a lot. I was rolling my eyes a ton during this book. The whole thing to me just very much read like a Wattpad fanfiction. So this book is part romance, part mystery, and part fantasy, but I didn't think that any of those 3 genres were well executed. The mystery was so boring to me, and I truly did not care what happened to the missing roommate, and I thought that the twist, that the reveals with that storyline were super lame. The male main character, the alpha werewolf, I thought was so very bland and had no chemistry with our female main character, Misery Lark, who is vampire royalty. The whole mate trope, I think, can be well done, but here I did not think it was well done. Everything felt very said and not seen. They talked a lot about their relationship, but I just didn't believe it. The whole thing read like a Twilight fanfiction to me. There was a lot of talks of smells and how like the werewolf could not stand to be in the same room as Misery at first, which was very reminiscent of Twilight in the science room scene where Edward like covers his nose and Bella thinks that she smells bad. It was very much that. And blood play during intercourse, and for our male main character there was a lot of talk of his knot, which is basically like a knot you would see in dogs that makes their butts stick together when they have sex. And so I guess the whole thing was supposed to be taboo, but to me it just gave me the ick. I really didn't like it. Did I hate this book? Not necessarily, but I definitely did not like it. I just don't think Ali Hazelwood shines in this genre, so I probably won't read any of her fantasy books in the future. However, I do like her classic rom-coms in STEM. Speaking of which, I want to talk about Czech and Mate, which I'm giving 4 stars. Now, I don't want to go too in-depth on the Ali Hazelwood books since I made a whole video about them before, but I will just talk a little bit about highs and lows with the books. This is Ali Hazelwood's young adult novel, and I surprisingly really liked it a lot. This book is so similar to The Queen's Gambit, which I love that show so dearly, and the 2 similarities are almost uncanny. The main character in this book is like a childhood prodigy in chess. She has a sad backstory, she has this kind of traumatic past, and so we see her navigate the world of competitive chess and also find love. There's a lot of great tension in this book. It almost makes you feel like you're falling in love for the first time. These teenagers have just a really wholesome and sweet relationship. Ali Hazelwood threw in a bunch of Gen Z references in this book, I guess to make her main character sound younger or to appeal to a younger audience, but she leaned in pretty hard to this, and I don't think it came across as sounding natural. It didn't really work for me. However, it doesn't take away enough from the book that I wouldn't recommend it to adults. Okay, let's talk about Juniper and Thorn. This book was a catastrophic disappointment to me. It is based on a Grimm's Brother fairy tale called The Juniper Tree, which I wasn't familiar with at all. It's not a story that I've ever heard growing up. I do like fairy tale retellings. However, it's good to know that this story has a content warning list that is like a novel of its own. We have animal abuse, eating disorders, murder, emotional/psychological abuse, xenophobia, sexual abuse of adults and minors, torture, incest, and cannibalism. And somehow this book still managed to be incredibly boring to me. I'm giving it 1 star. I really struggled to get through this book. I almost DNF'd it, but my morbid curiosity just kept me going. I don't know, maybe it's too highbrow for me and I'm just a big dumb idiot, but I'd like to think I'm not. I have so very many thoughts about this book that I think I'm going to do a full video where I go through the entire plot and talk about spoilers and also maybe make a recipe from the book because they talk about food a lot in this book. This book is set in like Eastern Europe, and there's a really heavy theme of unending hunger throughout the book. They talk about Eastern European food a lot, and it made me really hungry. So by the time I was finished with the book, I just felt hungry, empty, and disappointed. I have seen so many good reviews about this book, and so it was just a shock to me how much I didn't like it. I do see the appeal. I mean, we've got 3 witches that live in an estate with their cursed father, who is a very powerful wizard. There are murders in the town, there are monsters in the garden, there's a love story, there's mystery. There are a lot of taboo themes that are talked about, but I'll tell you what, at the end of the book, I didn't care about any of it at all. I'm giving this book 1 star. Please don't come for me. All right, so next up, let's talk about my favorite Ali Hazelwood book. This one is Love Theoretically, and I give this one 4.5 out of 5 stars because I thought it was a really enjoyable read. The banter between these two is just so fun. It's incredible. I think that Ali Hazelwood really does banter well, and I really see that in this book. Jack and Elsie are my favorite of her main characters. I like the enemies to lover trope. I love the fake dating with like a twist, and I like the academia setting. There were some twists in here that I thought were actually pretty well done and kept the story moving at a fairly quick pace. Again, I'm not going to go too heavily into this book since I talked about it before, but I would say that if you have never read one of Ali Hazelwood's books and don't know where to start, or if you've read one of her other books and didn't like it, this may be a good one to try again or try for the first time. It was definitely a very like light and fluffy feel-good book that was a quick read, so it's not going to be like an epic love story, but if you're just looking for something fun, it's enjoyable. Okay, so finally, let's talk about Neon Gods. Now, this book is my Smut Book Club Book of the Month for March, and it's supposed to be this kinky retelling of Hades and Persephone. Now, I'm just gonna start by saying it's basically just porn with like a little sprinkling of plot. Is the writing good? No, it sure is not, but I don't really care because I'm not here for an elegant story. Are there lots of gaping plot holes? Yes, there are, amongst other holes. Basically, the book is set in modern-day Olympus, and it follows these gods and goddesses who aren't truly divine. It's more of like an oligarchy structure. Different positions are in charge of different facets of the government with like a wink at Greek mythology. So for example, in Demeter's position, she is in charge of agriculture. In Dionysus' position, he's in charge of like food and beverage and more like party supply chain things. So nobody actually has any real powers. They're not truly the gods and goddesses that we know from mythology. However, it's more of a political position with those characters in mind. I thought it was an interesting take on a retelling, and I appreciate that she tried to kind of take the trope and spin it on its head, but I will say I was a little disappointed that it was more of a political front and that these aren't actually the gods and goddesses that we're reading about. Now, Persephone and Hades have this like sex bargain that benefits both of them, but is a huge political affront to Zeus. And so there is this forbidden love aspect that is, again, kind of a nod at the true mythology. Now, let's talk about the sex. It is pretty spicy. The smut doesn't start for probably almost 100 pages in this book, but once it does, it takes up the majority of this book. Hades has this playroom where he hosts a lot of sex parties, so there's a lot of public sex that happens, and exhibitionism, voyeurism at play, as well as some bondage and more like dom-sub relationships. A lot of these things are touched on, but not too heavily explored. The consensus I get from my book club is that everybody thought it was very naughty and fun, but aside from the smut, the book was pretty subpar. It was fine. I didn't really like or dislike it, so it gets a 3 from me. It's the first in a series of many, so if you like this book, it's exciting because there's lots of books like it to read. Now, each of the books follows a different god and goddess. I think the next one is on Eros and Psyche. I probably won't be reading it, but I think some of my friends will be. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. I had a lot of fun making this video. I hope you had fun watching it, and if you did, please subscribe and I will see you soon.